On October 28th, as Israeli forces were preparing to start their ground operations to enter the Gaza Strip, Israeli Prime Minister addressed them. In his speech, he made a quick reference to a passage from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. He said, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you." Here's a clip.
All of Israeli leadership, we all embrace them and believe them. You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible. And we do remember, and we are fighting. Our brave troops and combatants who are now in Gaza or around Gaza and in all other regions in Israel are joining this chain of Jewish heroes, a chain that has started 3,000 years ago from Joshua ben Nun until the heroes of 1948, the Six-Day War, the 73 October War, and all other wars in this country. Our hero troops, they have one supreme main goal: to completely defeat the murderous enemy and to guarantee our existence in this country. We've always said, never again. Never again is now.
For context, he said this in a speech announcing the start of a ground invasion in Gaza. He pointed out that the Israeli soldiers who were about to enter Gaza were part of a legacy that goes back 3,000 years, all the way back to Joshua, son of Nun, the warrior leader who fought so bravely to settle the Israelite tribes in the Promised Land. This reference to Amalek started a firestorm of criticism. Several news media decried that it was a veiled reference to indiscriminate genocide of Gaza Palestinians. Let's read some of the titles from media criticizing Netanyahu. Here's the title: Netanyahu's reference to violent biblical passages raised alarm among critics. PM Netanyahu invokes Amalek theory to justify Gaza killings. What is this Hebrew Bible nation? Again, another one: old-time religion. Netanyahu invokes scripture as Hamas fight becomes Israel's holy war. Netanyahu declares a holy war of annihilation on civilians of Gaza, citing the Bible. Comparing Hamas to Amalek, our biblical nemesis will ultimately hurt Israel. Chen Guigir, in a heated debate in a Piers Morgan show, vehemently criticized Israel for scheming to commit genocide on the basis of this Amalek reference.
It's Israel doing genocide on the Palestinians right now. And there's IDF soldiers singing and in video that the IDF has confirmed about how they're going to wipe out the seed of Amalek. That is a verse in the old Hebrew Bible that talks about exterminating Amalek. So they're talking about genocide against Palestinians. Benjamin Netanyahu has also talked about wiping out Amalek. These are open calls for genocide.
Now, you might wonder, why is this brief reference to Amalek trigger pro-Palestinian supporters so much? In this video, we shall analyze who the Amalek or the Amalekites were. Let's see especially what Bible says about them and their relationship with the ancient Israelites. We shall also see how this term and the concept Amalek has gone through a transformation through the centuries. After covering these preliminary information, we will attempt to understand the reference made by Netanyahu and see whether he was intending it as a veiled threat to commit mass genocide of the Gaza Palestinians. As this is a highly sensitive issue, we must try to be as objective and compassionate as possible, keeping our emotions and preconceived notions aside in the pursuit of peace. Welcome to Discern Scripture YouTube channel. We post videos regularly on various biblical topics. We would really appreciate if you subscribe and help us reach wider audience. Now, let's get on with the video. Who were the Amalek or Amalekites? A biblical overview. First, let's explore the origins of the Amalekites. There are some debate among the biblical scholars on the exact origin of the Amalekites. There are two views. First is a minority view, and the later one is more common. Let's go over them one by one. The first view holds that Amalekites are one of the pre-Israelite Canaanite tribes that lived in Canaan before the arrival of Abraham and the Israelites. They would quote Genesis 14:7 to support their argument. In Genesis 14, a group of kings were invading the land of Canaan and defeated the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and plundered the region. This is what the verse says. And they returned and came to En-Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites. The reference to the country of the Amalekites is the first reference to Amalek or Amalekites in the entire Bible. Some scholars take it literally and say that the Amalekites were one of the indigenous Canaanite tribes. I must remind you that this is the minority view on the origin of the Amalekites. Let's go to the second view. The second view on the origin of Amalek has much more acceptance in the mainstream scholarship. They hold that the origin of the Amalekites to a later period. They would point that Amalekites were not mentioned in the table of the nations in Genesis chapter 10. They would take Genesis 14:7 as anachronism, part of late scribal updating of the text. They would point out that Amalek is one of the grandsons of Esau. You might remember Isaac had two sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau was Isaac's firstborn and a favorite son. Esau's descendants were called Edomites. Amalekites were most likely one of the subgroups within the Edomites. Esau had 3 wives. Through them, he got totally 5 sons and 10 grandchildren. Amalek was one of his grandsons through the line of Esau's firstborn, Eliphaz. He is identified as son of Eliphaz through his concubine named Timnah. We see the reference in Genesis chapter 36, verse 12. Esau's son Eliphaz also had a concubine named Timnah, who bore him Amalek. This genealogical connection establishes a familial relationship between the Edomites and the Amalekites, as both are considered descendants of Esau. The Edomites settled in the region of Edom, southeast of Israel, while the Amalekites were often associated with the region of the Negev and the Sinai Peninsula. We see the reference in the Bible in Numbers chapter 13, verse 29. Here the spies who went into the promised land to explore the land, they came back and they were giving their report to Moses, and this is what they said. They gave Moses this account: we went into the land to which you sent us, and it flows with milk and honey. Here is the fruit. And in verse 29, the Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. So by the time Israelites entered Canaan, Amalekites became a significant desert tribe occupying the Negev and Sinai Peninsula. Since Israelites were wandering for 40 years in the Sinai desert, they were intercepted by Amalekites who were also living in the same region, had conflicts with them during their wilderness journey. Now let's go to the Battle of Rephidim in Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 to 16, the first Israel-Amalek conflict. This Battle of Rephidim took place during the Israelites' journey through the wilderness after their liberation from the slavery in Egypt. According to the biblical narrative, the Israelites were led by Moses. They were traveling through the wilderness and they faced a challenge at Rephidim due to the lack of water. The people grumbled and complained against Moses and questioned why he brought them out of Egypt to face thirst in the desert. In response to their complaints, Moses sought guidance from God, and God instructed him to strike a rock with his staff. And Moses did so. Water miraculously flowed from the rock, providing for the needs of the people. So while the Israelites were at Rephidim, the Amalekites attacked them. Moses instructed Joshua to choose men to go and fight against the Amalekites, while he and Aaron and Hur went up to the top of a hill. So Moses held up his staff, and as long as his hands were raised, the Israelites prevailed. However, when Moses grew tired and lowered his hand, the Amalekites gained the advantage. To assist Moses, Aaron and Hur provided a stone for him to sit on, and they supported his hands, keeping them raised until sunset. With this help, the Israelites ultimately defeated the Amalekites in the battle. Moses built an altar and he named it Yahweh Nissi, the Lord is our banner, emphasizing the role of God in their victory. The Battle of Rephidim is significant in the biblical narrative as a demonstration of God's provision and assistance to Israel in times of war. It also serves as a precursor to the broader theme of the Israelites' conflict with various nations during their journey to the Promised Land. In the Promised Land, the later Israel-Amalek conflicts. Rephidim was not the last place Amalekites attacked Israel. The Amalekites later joined with the Canaanites and attacked the Israelites at Hormah. Numbers chapter 14, verse 45. Then the Amalekites and Canaanites who lived in the hill country came down and attacked them and beat them down all the way to Hormah. Not just that, even after Israel entered and settled in Canaan, Amalekites continued to pose an existential threat to Israel. In the book of Judges, we see that they banded together with Canaanites and people from neighboring regions like Moabites and Ammonites to wage war on the Israelites. Judges chapter 3 verse 13. Getting the Ammonites and Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms, that is Jericho. Another reference from Judges chapter 6 verse 3. For whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern people invaded the country. So here Amalekites were part of the alliance with Midianites. They constantly attacked Israel and impoverished the people of Israel. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 to 19. This is one of the key passages on Amalek. As we saw above, Israel crossed paths with Amalek at different times. Amalek's battle with Israel while they were at Rephidim became a crucial paradigm through which their future interactions were viewed. Right after the battle, the Lord told Moses to write down the events that happened in Rephidim. This is what God said in Exodus chapter 17, verse 14. The Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under the heaven. At the end of the 40 years wandering in the wilderness, while the new generation of Israelites were about to enter the promised land, Moses recounted their journey from Egypt to up until that point. Except Joshua and Caleb, every person who left Egypt died by that time. Moses gave this charge to the new generation that was ready to enter the promised land. This is what the passage says. Remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land he is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. So in this passage, Moses was instructing the Israelites to remember the unprovoked attack by the Amalekites on the Israelites during their weary journey from Egypt to the promised land. What made these attacks sinister and evil? At least two things can be said in this connection. First, Amalekites attacked all who were lagging behind, the most weary ones. They attacked those most vulnerable, most likely at the rear end of the Israelite line. God saw that action of Amalek attacking the weakest and the most vulnerable as evil. Second, Amalek had forgotten that Israelites were related to Esau. Israelites were the descendants of Jacob, the younger brother of their ancestor Esau. They did not show any brotherly bond or compassion to the weary Israelites stumbling across the desert. They did not receive them with bread and water. Rather, they brought sword and warfare against them. So here we must remember God's promise to Abraham. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who treat you with contempt. And all the people on the earth will be blessed through you. So Amalek attempt to destroy Israel, and they will reap destruction as their reward. And God saw their lack of compassion and violence as worthy of judgment. The divine judgment against the Amalekites was due to their aggression against the vulnerable fugitives and their lack of fear of God and compassion for the weakest. God rejected Saul from kingship because he did not destroy Amalek. He did not execute his commandment completely. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 2 and 3, Prophet Samuel passed on God's command to Saul. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. The command was clear. God was seeking retribution for the Amalekites' past actions, particularly their attack on the Israelites in Rephidim as they journeyed from Egypt. The severity of the command is striking. It includes the total destruction of all living beings and possessions associated with the Amalekites. So King Saul was given the responsibility to carry out judgment against the Amalekites as the appointed leader of Israel. However, when Saul carried out the military campaign, he spared the Amalekite king Agag and some of the best livestock, deviating from God's explicit command. This disobedience led to Samuel's rebuke of Saul, and it marked a turning point in Saul's reign, signaling the decline of his kingship. The failure to fully carry out this command has significant consequences for Saul. God rejected Saul from being king. David was chosen in his place to lead Israel. 1 Samuel chapter 30 reports an Amalekite raid on Ziklag, a Judean village where David and his men had their families and held property. The Amalekites burned the village and took captive all the women and children, including 2 of David's wives. David and his men pursued them all the way and defeated the Amalekites and rescued all the hostages and brought everyone back. We can see that David did not kill all the Amalekites, he defeated them. Many Amalekites escaped. Much later, during the reign of King Hezekiah in the late 8th century, a group of Simeonites killed the remaining Amalekites who had been living in the hill country of Seir. We can read about it in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 42 and 43. Let's read verse 42. 500 of these Simeonites, led by Pelatiah, Neriah, Rephaiah, and Uzziel, the sons of Ishi, invaded the hill country of Seir. They killed the remaining Amalekites who had escaped, and they have lived there to this day. One of the tribes of Israel, the tribe of Simeon, destroyed the Amalekites and took over their lands. Haman, the last Amalek descendant who tried to destroy all the Jews. The last mention of the Amalekites is found in the book of Esther. Haman the Agagite, a descendant of Agag. So he is considered by many biblical scholars and Jewish rabbis as a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag, who was captured by King Saul, later killed by Prophet Samuel. Haman schemed to have all the Jews in Persia annihilated by the order of King Xerxes. But God saved the Jews in Persia through the heroic efforts of Queen Esther. Esther chapter 9 verses 5 to 10 tells us that Haman and his sons and the rest of the Israelites' enemies were destroyed by the order of King Xerxes. In summary, the Amalekite hatred of Israel and Jews and their repeated attempts to destroy God's people led to their ultimate doom. Their fate should be a warning to all who would attempt to curse whom God has blessed. We don't hear about Amalekites in the later biblical literatures, like the prophetic writings. They ceased to exist as a distinct people group. Amalek in history. How did this concept evolve? All Jewish people are taught and are encouraged to follow 613 commandments or mitzvot. There are 3 mitzvot or commandments about Amalek that are part of these 613 commandments. Mitzvot 591 to 613 deal with laws of sovereigns and their wars. 3 of them relate with Amalek, particularly 598, 599, and 600. This is what 598 says: blot out seed of Amalek. 599, remember what Amalek did to us. And 600, don't forget his evil deeds. Now, we already know Amalekites as a distinct people group ceased to exist by the time of King Hezekiah in the 8th century BC. How do the rabbis interpret the mitzvot 599 to wipe out the descendants or the seed of Amalek? Most of the rabbis agree that it was not a commandment to be executed today, since we do not know who the real descendants of the Amalekites are. Some rabbis would explain that God would perform the elimination of Amalek, but Jews are commanded only to remember what Amalek did to them. We need to understand that there was a shift in the Jewish understanding of who Amalek was. In the post-biblical times, the term and the concept associated with Amalek went through reinterpretation and reappropriation. The rabbis view the mitzvah to wipe out the descendants of Amalek as a call to oppose and eradicate evil forces or ideologies that threaten the well-being of Jewish people or humanity in general. In their view, Amalek becomes a metaphor for all those who do injustice and aggression against innocents. Jews are taught the importance of remembering and confronting injustice in every generation. Also, Israelis have applied this term Amalek to those who expressed strong hatred against the Jews in various time periods. to those expressed anti-Semitic sentiments. From that perspective, Amalek would be a person or a group that is primarily driven by their unmitigated hatred against the Jews. The semantic horizons of the term has been expanded over time. You can see how this term Amalekites are transmutated from referring to a distinct nomadic desert tribes to people with anti-Jewish ideologies. In the modern times, Amalek or Amalekites have come to represent an irreconcilable enemy that wants to destroy Jews. And so Jews in post-biblical times have associated their various enemies with Haman or Amalek. Some groups have been identified as Amalek or anti-Semitic: Romans, Nazis, Stalinists, ISIS, and others. Some individuals have been identified as Amalek: Hitler, Stalin, and others. Some Hasidic rabbis have identified ideologies such as atheism as Amalek. This is a metaphorical application of the term Amalek as someone who opposes God and God's chosen people. So in summary, the term Amalek can be somewhat compared with anti-Semitism. When talking about Amalek, Israelis today do not think of physical descendants of ancient Amalekites. Rather, they think of the spirit of Amalek that is still at play, the prejudice, the hatred, the violence orchestrated against the Jews in various parts of the world make them remember Amalek, their ancient nemesis. If you notice the occasions when this term has been used, it has been used whenever the survival of the Jewish people was threatened by external forces. Netanyahu on Amalek. What has he actually meant? In the aftermath of Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu told the soldiers and the nation to remember what the Amalek has done to you. In this case, he was referring to the enemy that launched an unprovoked attack on Israel. First, I would like to explore whether this application of Amalek analogy to this particular case is reasonable. Second, whether Bibi called for the genocide of Palestinians when he applied the Amalek terminology. First, did Hamas behave like Amalek on October the 7th? Is it a correct identification? Israel was getting ready to observe Shimchat Torah, the celebration of the annual completion of the reading of the Jewish holy book in their synagogues. At 6:29 a.m., Hamas launched 3,000 rockets and attacked on Israeli army installations and communities near the Gaza border. More than 1,400 Israelis died, most of them unarmed civilians. They attacked Israeli communities, slaughtering families and children and taking hostages, hundreds of them. Even peace activists who worked for peace between Israel and Palestinians were taken as hostages. From an Israeli perspective, this attack was unprovoked and orchestrated with utmost hatred against the Jews. Hamas attacked the most vulnerable, just like the Amalekites attacked those lagging behind in Rephidim. There is plenty of similarity between the attack of Amalekites and the Hamas killing spree on October 7th. They view Hamas as driven by the same hostile spirit of Amalek, exacting vengeance against the civilians, not military combatants. We can understand why Bibi Netanyahu applied this Amalek analogy in his speech. Now to the question, what Netanyahu meant when he used the Amalek reference. There are two possibilities. One, he called for the indiscriminate genocide of Palestinians, or he was calling for the consolidation of Israelites to counter the threat that they were facing. Many in pro-Palestinian media quickly point out the reference to Amalek and its close association with the call to blot out Amalekites completely from the face of the earth, an indiscriminate destruction of the enemy. However, on close examination of Netanyahu's speech, he was appealing to the collective memory of the Jewish people to consolidate against the forces that tried to destroy them. Robert Spencer thinks in these similar lines.
What is an example in the Old Testament of a context-directed call to kill a certain group?
Well, for example, you have the killing of the Amalekites. The Amalekites are an ancient people that have died out. There aren't any Amalekites today. And so there is a command in the Old Testament that the Israelites should hunt down and kill the Amalekites because the Amalekites are irredeemably evil, and even the children and so on. And this is something that is often invoked today to make the claim that Judaism and Christianity, since this is part of the Christian Bible as well, are just as violent or equally capable of being violent as the teachings of Islam. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu actually aided this case recently, inadvertently, by referring to this passage when he was calling upon Israelis to fight Hamas in the wake of the October 7th massacres. The thing is, though, that Netanyahu was referring to it metaphorically in terms of the Amalekites standing for the people who are evil who need to be combated. And he was not calling, obviously, for the genocide of the Gazans or anybody else.
I think he is right. Bibi was not calling to commit the genocide of the Palestinians. He was reminding the nation of the gravity of the threat they were facing. People like Cheng overreact to Bibi's Amalek reference in an attempt to highlight the Palestinian suffering. Now, we can debate whether it is right to use a controversial text about Amalek in the context of the ongoing war. One thing is clear: God's command to kill Amalek was limited to a specific time and period in history. When we think about it, it also has its own difficulties to deal with. But we must remember that it is not applicable to our times. Any attempt to apply this passage literally in our times is incompatible with the scriptural context and its intention. So here is my closing thoughts. Let the pursuit of peace be our goal. How to defeat the enemy once and for all. Both sides try hard to decimate the other. Hamas and most Palestinian supporters want the state of Israel be dismantled to realize their greater Palestine dream. Israel wants to get rid of Hamas completely to ensure their future security. The quick solution for both is violent retaliation. You kill 1,000, I kill 10,000. You kill 10,000 and I kill 100,000. Violence begets violence. Sword brings sword. Blood calls for blood. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 26, verse 53, "For all who draw the sword will die by the sword." How can one assume that peace can be achieved through violence? A political solution and a compromise of some sort through dialogue and diplomacy should be the priority to minimize the suffering of the innocents on both sides. How far we have progressed on this direction? This is a question every person who is involved in this conflict must seriously think about. It is heartbreaking to see the loss of innocent lives caught in the middle of this prolonged conflict. I would like to conclude this discussion with a brief biblical reflection. The Bible tells us that the human sin has created a chasm between people and God. It also brought distance between one another as well. We are not able to love others as we love ourselves. In a sense, the real enemy is within us. It is in our inability to love one another, accept the other, and live alongside peacefully. We say that we love God, but we refuse to show compassion and love those who are living next to us in the same geographical region. How can one who truly claims to love God do that? 1 John chapter 4, verse 20 highlights this point. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister, whom they have seen, cannot love God, whom they have not seen. Genuine love for God is expressed in how one loves and treats others. Our religions, our faiths, our beliefs must move us to greater compassion, greater love, and greater acceptance of the other. It must not lead us to greater violence, destruction, and suffering of more innocence. How can our inability to love the other be overcome and peace be realized? It can be done through the work of God in our hearts. This is what Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14 says. For Christ himself is our peace, he who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of partition, the enmity. Jesus, through his death on the cross, absorbed the violence, overcame the utter humiliation, and showed a path for reconciliation and peaceful coexistence.
He's brilliant what Jesus say. For you have heard it say in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's the old law. That's the old covenant. But I now say to turn the other cheek. For you have heard it say to love your friends and hate your enemy. That's the old law. That's the Old Testament. That's the old covenant. But I now say to love your enemy. That's my Jesus. And there, when he was being defended by his disciples, Peter takes out his sword and cuts off the ear of the servant. Jesus would not even let his disciple defend him. He turns towards Peter after taking the ear and putting it back on the servant. He turns toward Peter and says, put away your sword. For he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. That's our paradigm. And see, that's what we have been teaching for the last 2,000 years. Thank God for Jesus.
Romans chapter 5 verse 5 points out that God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. Only with this divine empowerment we will be able to love the other, the enemy, unconditionally. Meanwhile, let us continue to pray for lasting peace and brotherhood between Israel and Palestinians. The future lies not in the destruction of the other, but in coexistence in the same geographic region as neighbors. May compassion prevail over hatred. May the war cease and peace be restored. Thank you for watching this video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe and support our channel. Click on the bell icon so that you can get notification whenever we post a new video. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. God bless you all. Shalom.